Hey everyone, welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're embarking on a really fascinating forensic investigation into, honestly, one of the most massive historical misconceptions of the modern era. We're going to examine a text that is absolutely central to debates on governance and justice and uncover what the primary sources actually say about it. We'll be looking closely at the evidence, piece by piece, to separate what was an ancient living tradition from a very modern construction. So get ready, because the historical record is vastly richer than what we've all been told. Okay, let's just dive right into this. You've probably heard this widely taught myth. The Manusmriti is the universal law book of Hinduism. I mean, if you open up standard textbooks, read academic papers, or just listen to public debates across the globe, you're going to see this claim presented as an absolute settled fact. It's taught as this definitive, overarching document from which Hindu society supposedly drew its rigid rules for centuries. People really believe we were all just strictly bound to this one book. And this single assumption has dramatically shaped modern policy and our entire global understanding of an ancient culture.
But what if the primary sources tell a completely different story? What if the idea that everyone was unilaterally bound to this one specific book is, well, entirely historically inaccurate? Today, we're basically opening up a historical cold case to find out the actual truth of what this text was, how it came to be, and what the actual reality of ancient Indian jurisprudence really looked like prior to colonial rule. So, here's our temporal roadmap for this investigation. We'll start back in the ancient era where multiple texts existed, hit a pretty pivotal colonial intervention in 1794, and then jump forward to the rigorous modern scholarship of 1930 and 2005 that finally recovered the truth. Let's see how this all unfolds.
Section 1. 1794. The Calcutta Intervention.
All right, so picture this. We're jumping right into the late 18th century. It's 1794, and the British East India Company is busy consolidating its power in Bengal. Sir William Jones, who was this incredibly brilliant British judge appointed to the Supreme Court, faced a massive logistical problem. British courts were required to apply quote-unquote Hindu law for things like inheritance and marriage. But when they looked around, they realized there was absolutely no single, uniform document to use. They demanded a rigid, workable code where none actually existed. They basically needed a statute book, and fast.
So to solve this administrative headache, Jones commissioned a translation of one specific text. It was published posthumously in 1796 under the title Institutes of Hindu Law, or the Ordinances of Manu. By producing this one document, colonial courts artificially positioned a singular text as the definitive Hindu legal code. And the great irony here is that the supposedly universal law of an ancient civilization was actually commissioned by an 18th century British judge. It wasn't chosen because the tradition itself gave it supreme authority. Not at all. It was chosen simply because the administration required one easy text to govern its subjects.
Section 2. India's True Legal Ecology. So if the Manusmriti wasn't the sole law of the land, what actually was? Well, let's contrast the two paradigms directly. The colonial model assumed a single, uniformly applied statute book. But the ancient reality was something entirely different. Pre-colonial India actually operated on a vast, pluralistic, and constantly debated ecology of texts. It was this vibrant, living tradition that deeply respected regional customs, royal edicts, and local community practices. Dharmaśāstra was learned counsel, you see, not some monolithic enforced law. Just look at this incredible diversity. As documented by authoritative scholars like Ludo Rocher, the Manusmriti was literally just one voice among many. You had the Yajnavalkya, the Narada, the Vishnu, the Parashara, and dozens of others. Different communities followed completely different texts. Commentators within the tradition regularly argued with Manu. They qualified its statements, or they just outright rejected passages entirely in favor of these other authorities. So the whole illusion of a single dominant law book just totally vanishes.
And to really put that into perspective, we can look at the 5 massive volumes of P.V. Kane's 1930 masterpiece, The History of Dharmaśāstra. I mean, Kane spent decades mapping this intellectual tradition, and his work conclusively documented that regional legal practices drew heavily on entirely different authorities. In Bengal, for instance, legal practice drew on the Dayabhaga, while South India drew on completely different texts again. The idea that Manu was a universal law had practically zero basis in the tradition's daily practice.
Section 3. Layers, Additions, and Contradictions. Okay, so we know the text wasn't the sole law of the land, but what about the actual text of the Manusmriti itself? To find out, we turn to Patrick Olivelle's groundbreaking 2005 analysis, where he produced a critical edition. Now, this isn't just a simple translation, it's a meticulous scholarly reconstruction. Olivelle compared manuscripts from different centuries just to figure out which verses were original and which ones were inserted much later. And he conclusively proved that the Manusmriti is a heavily layered text. It accumulated across centuries, touched by multiple hands. It's really like a giant puzzle.
Now, what's really interesting about this is how this layering creates profound internal tensions. Take a look at verse 3.55, where women are honored, there the gods rejoice. This is a highly revered verse, right? Yet it sits inside the exact same document as verses that seem to severely restrict women. It dramatically contradicts the restrictive passages that are most frequently cited by critics today.
So how in the world do we explain these glaring internal contradictions? Well, it's called textual interpolation. Olivelle's critical apparatus reveals that many of the most oppressive and restrictive verses, the exact ones in stark tension with verses like the one we just read, are the exact same verses that appear totally inconsistently across different regional manuscripts. They are the undeniable signature of a text that has been heavily interpolated and altered over centuries, rather than a single coherent, intentional code of law.
Section 4. The methodology of debate. So the crucial point is, how did ancient Indian society actually function with texts that were full of internal tensions? The answer is the Mimamsa discipline, a super rigorous interpretive methodology. Scholars didn't just read these texts blindly, no way. They analyzed texts, strictly reconciled apparent contradictions, assigned priority, and heavily contextualized principles based on the specific time and place. In fact, Kulukabada's 12th century commentary on Manu is actually longer than the text itself. This was learned counsel, requiring deep human interpretation, not an unquestionable rigid statute.
Section 5. Restoring the historical record.
We've traced the timeline, the colonial courts, and the scholarship. And it all brings us to this absolutely crucial takeaway. We are not defending, we are restoring. The Manusmriti was a complex, heavily interpolated document that was constantly debated. It was never the absolute authority that an entire civilization was uniformly bound to. The true historical record is vastly richer, significantly more pluralistic, and infinitely more intellectually vibrant than the flat, rigid colonial narrative the world was handed back in 1794. I want to leave you with a final kind of provocative thought today. If the supposedly universal law book of an entire civilization turns out to be basically an administrative band-aid for an 18th century British court, what other historical facts that we just blindly accept as absolute truth might actually be colonial administrative artifacts? Keep questioning, keep looking at the primary sources, and for sure, check out more of our explainers to keep uncovering the fascinating truths of our past. Thank you so much for exploring this with me today.
Distorted narratives can warp a civilization's future. Alignments in the sky never lie. Subscribe to step into the next forensic file. See the record corrected.